Hey guys, this is the Toasty3, and I'm going to talk about my sophomore year at Georgia Tech. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started. So, as already stated, I transferred to Georgia Tech after spending 1 year at UIUC. Anyways, in fall 2022, I took one CS class and one math class. CS 1331 and Math 1564, which is the honors version of 1554, which is linear algebra. As always, we're going to start in order, so CS 1331 first. So this class was, they gave out weekly homework assignments. They were a little bit long, but they weren't too bad to get done. The only issue was that a lot of the homeworks were fairly mundane and were kind of repetitive in the steps they had to take, if I remember correctly. But the hardest part of the class was definitely the exams. I took the online section of the class, and from what I've heard, this professor has pretty tricky exams compared to others, but I'm not entirely sure on that. Anyways, I distinctly remember the good old days where I would just stay up until 4 a.m. before each exam the night before, and I would drink coffee and then just look at the videos on Canvas and just plow through them as I was fighting my urge to fall asleep. I also remember before the first exam, I was definitely scared because some of the questions on the study guide were pretty tricky and I just didn't know how to do them at first, so I spent an extra amount of time studying for that. But it paid off because I was able to get a 97 on the first test. And on the second one, I kind of lucked out because a lot of the questions were handwritten code, which I was actually better at than some of the multiple choice, so I got 94.5. And by the third exam, I just felt kind of confident, so I just didn't really try as hard, but I still did fine on the third one, 91.5. But then I didn't really study for the final, so I suddenly became kind of worried after that because they wouldn't return your final exam grades, which was kind of worrisome. So I had to wait until the grades came out on Oscar for me to get my A in the class. Otherwise, this class was a little bit tedious, but not too bad. And yeah, of course, I ended up with an A in the class because it wasn't too bad. So next up is Math 1564. So this class was definitely harder than 1331. The homework was different from 1554's homework, from what I can remember. Instead of going through more content, they go over more proofs and go further in depth into the content. At the time, the exams were also not the easiest. I got an 85 on the first one, and back then that was not good for me, but I've come to realize that, yeah, no, that's pretty good. The homework was also fairly lengthy. It took on average maybe 2 to 3 hours, but I learned from Math 347 honors and Math 461 from my freshman year to not slack off on homework in general, especially math homework, and so I managed to be more wise with my time. So the hardest part of this class was definitely the exams, but I found the content to be pretty interesting as well as some of the homework problems, so it kept my attention, and I was also able to get an A in the class. I do remember the final exam being pretty hard, especially one of the questions where I spent 60 minutes working on all the other questions, but then the remaining 110 minutes on this one question. I overheard one of my classmates say they got in like 10 seconds, and I was like, wait, what? But in hindsight, I guess the question was actually not too bad as long as you figured out the trick, which I guess you could say about a lot of questions, but yeah. I got an 81 on that final, but it wasn't enough to ruin my grade overall, which was nice. So that takes care of fall 22, so let's move on to spring 23. So this semester I took 2 CS classes and 2 math classes. So once again, let's go in order. Now CS 1332 was like CS 1331 in the sense that you used Java for both of them. You got weekly coding homework and you got 3 exams and 1 final. But I found CS 1332 to be conceptually harder but threw fewer trick questions than 1331 on the exams. but the harder concepts made the class harder overall. But it still wasn't like too bad. So you covered data structures for the first 2/3 of the class and then algorithms for the last third, though most of it was about data structures. The homework was about designing data structures from scratch, and they were usually like array-backed or some other type of underlying structure like that. The exams consist of a mixture of multiple choice questions and performing algorithms or data structure implementations on paper. And also similar to 1331, there were a lot of coding questions that you had to do by hand on the exams as well. I distinctly remember, although I did well in the first two exams, the third one I didn't really study as hard as I should have, so after the exam I was worried because I definitely did worse than the first two. And this would affect me being able to exempt the final exam, which I was worried about. Although technically I could just take the final and still get an A that way, but I didn't want to do that. But it turns out that I did well enough on exam 3, so I got exempt, so that felt really nice. Back then you needed to average an 89 on the 3 midterms, but I heard that they've recently bumped up to 94, which I definitely would not have been able to do back then. But yeah, that's 1332. The next one is CS 2110, and I just remember this being pretty hard for me, especially some of the homeworks, which took me way too long because I messed up understanding the instructions. I had to look at the class forum for help a lot, and some of the concepts took a while for me to get, like the LC3 data path. So for anyone taking this class, my advice would just be to like go to seek help often, like in office hours and through the class forum a lot, because those can really help you, because some of these concepts are pretty hard to grasp on their own. My version of the class also had 4 quizzes and 4 time labs, which are like the homework, but you have to do these problems in the time setting of 75 minutes. The quizzes were basically like exams, but they were only worth 5% each of your grade, and the timed exams were also 5% each of the grade. But so the time exams were very hit or miss. If you did the homework, ideally you would do well in the time labs, but not necessarily. And I remember on the last time lab, the C one, I just like screwed up and got like a 33 on it, which was terrible, and it made me scared about how I do on the final for an A in the class. But thankfully, there is a CIOS bonus, which is a survey where if enough people in the class fill it out, then you get bonus points. Actually, 1332 also had that, but 2110 had that, and it might have saved me a bit. But even without it, I think I would have done fine because the final was made easier than the quizzes and the time labs. So that was good. The class was pretty intense. It had quite a bit of work every week with 10 homeworks, and as I mentioned, 4 quizzes and 4 time labs and a final exam. But it was also really interesting to learn about low-level computer architecture, and this was a nice introduction to it, although it was fairly intense. So yeah, that takes care of that class. Next is Math 3406, so Linear Algebra 2. So Math 3406 was my first upper level math class at Georgia Tech, and it actually wasn't too bad, though I attribute part of it to me having some proof experience from past classes. And also, because I took 1564, I dabbled a bit in proofs in linear algebra already. But this class definitely went more in depth with proofs, and the concepts were harder to grasp for sure. There were also fewer computational questions, although there were still some. The exams were fairly difficult, but one thing that I found was that they were similar to the practice exams. So if I understood the practice exam solutions, then I didn't have to worry too much about the midterms. But the issue was just like CS 1332, I ran into an issue where on the third midterm, I didn't study as hard, so I was worried about whether my grade would be high enough where I wouldn't have to take the final exam, because this also had a similar thing, where the final exam would be optional if your initial rubric was high enough. But thankfully, it was high enough, so I was able to exempt, and this made me feel good as well. Some of the homework assignments did take a while. I do remember homework 4 being pretty lengthy, but overall, it wasn't the worst. I think they were generally shorter than 1564's homework. But yeah, the exams were kind of stressful and weighted very heavily. And last but certainly not least is Math 4317, Analysis 1, where I deliberately chose to take the hardest professor possible for this class. I literally looked at his average GPA, saw that was a 2.46 in past semesters, and decided, oh, I want to challenge myself with this class, with this instructor. What a bad idea that was, to say the least. So there were only 4 homework assignments in the class, but each one had like over 30 proof questions, all of them. To be fair, you got like 2 weeks to work on them, and I started like a week before each one, which is more time than I usually give myself. And sometimes I still barely finished. And I was like concentrated on doing these problems on most these days before they were due. And it still took a long time. As if that wasn't bad enough though, the midterms were pretty rough. After the first one, I predicted I'd get a 44 on it, but that was of course being too harsh on myself. My actual grade was a 76, which was actually upper quartile level, and that felt pretty relieving. And the second one went even better, where I got an 80, when the median was like in the 50s, I think. Yeah, it was pretty bad. But so all of this was on pace for an A, but guess what? The final exam happened, and it was so hard. I got a 36 out of 80, which is a 45%. Oh my gosh. This came out of left field, and the midterms were hard enough, but this just like sent it to impossible territory. So this class was just ridiculous because of this final exam mostly, but even just how many problems we had to do on the homeworks and the midterms, which were also pretty hard. So this was a B, and one of my only so far like 3 Bs at Georgia Tech. Spoiler alert. So that concludes spring 2023, unfortunately on a low note due to analysis 1. But wait, I took 4 classes in CS and Math in summer 2023, so let's go over that next. Starting off with the hardest one of the semester, CS 2200, Systems and Networks. So this is a continuation of CS 2110 from spring 2023, where we go further into low-level computer architecture, and then a tiny bit in networking, but it's so little that it might as well not be in the title of the course. But yeah, most of it is systems. We covered virtual memory, scheduling, and we had 5 projects, and that was the bulk of the difficulty of the course. These were much harder than the homeworks of 2110 for the most part. And it was definitely hard enough where I had to get some help from TAs and the course forum. This was made harder though because it was the summer, so not many people used it. As if that wasn't bad enough, there were 4 exams, and some of these were pretty hard, and they definitely were a time crunch. So definitely be on your A game when it comes to using your notes, because these were open notes, and your calculator, because there were a lot of calculation problems, which thankfully weren't too bad for me in general. But yeah, these exams were also worth a lot of the grade for some reason. Like 15% each, I believe. So 60% of the grade overall for some reason, despite the projects being a lot more in-depth and rigorous. As well as those things, there was an extra credit final project, which I actually did, but it took so long, like 17 hours in total for some reason. But I managed to finish, and it was worth 2.5 bonus points of your grade, which is pretty significant. but it was worth so much effort. So, was it worth it? I mean, I guess it was still worth it, but it was so hard. Okay, next up is CS 2340, Objects in Design. I wasn't the biggest fan of the course, but honestly, most people don't seem to be, but I'm not sure. Back then, I was a lot worse at group work and being a part of a team, so this was no exception. I didn't do that much work in this class, and unfortunately, I did manage to get away with it, which I regret. But yeah, this class was like software engineering introduction. So we were put into teams for the entire semester, and we were given some coding project to work on. And we had to make a few games, and I don't remember too much else about the course, but in general, that was the focus. There were some exams, which I didn't do well on, but they weren't worth too much of the grade, thankfully. And there was a lot of extra credit, which was nice. But overall, unfortunately, I don't know what else to say about the course. But I did manage to get an A in the class. Next up is CS 3001. This was the ethics course that all CS majors have to take, although there are probably other options for it. But 3001 is the most popular. So this class had a lot of writing, essays and stuff. We also had to write a 10-page final paper, which was definitely the most involved project of the semester. I heard in other semesters they also get exams, but we didn't get any exams, so we lucked out there. But we did have long recitations where we had to discuss a topic every week in these groups. And usually I wouldn't be able to say anything, and the TA would give me like 6 out of 10s on some of these recitations. But I managed to pull it together and get better scores towards the end, because I did know to actually contribute more, and I found just ways to BS and say stuff. And the last course was Math 4107, which is Abstract Algebra 1. So this was a little bit hard, especially with the midterm. There were only 3 homework assignments, but each one was worth 10% of the grade. I remember in homework 2, I screwed up a fair amount and got like an 80 on it, but I was allowed to revise the lowest homework, so I got a 90 because you could get half credit back. The midterm exam was pretty hard, but thankfully I managed to actually do surprisingly well, like up high 80s on it. I predicted like low 70s, so they definitely graded pretty leniently on that. And the only other components were attending class, because it was part of the grade. You had to attend all of them to get this credit, if I remember correctly. You also had a final project, actually 2 final projects. One was a portfolio where you had to collect problems and write solutions for them. I think it was 10 problems that related to algebra. And then the other component was like a mini research paper where you had to look at a topic and write a paper and make a video presentation on it. This seemed a little bit stressful at first, but I actually knew exactly what to present on and write about, and I dragged my partner in, and I actually carried most of the project, which felt really nice. And I usually don't do it because I usually follow along with what the group has to do. So this felt like a rare instance where I actually took the lead in the project, which felt nice. There's not much else to talk about for this one, so I'm just gonna end it there. And I managed to get a 95 point something, 6.3 I think, which was definitely an A, so that's good. Alright, so that takes care of all of my classes in sophomore year. Tune in next time for junior year, where I decide to go much more intense on my course load for some reason, which we will see in the next video, so stay tuned for that.